Hey class, this is a little quick video about coding. Coding is what you do to qualitative data to help you make sense of what you are looking at and better. So data analysis and qualitative research involves comprehending what you're studying, synthesizing that, looking for relationships between what is being said, what is being discussed, is being seen, theorizing about why these relationships appear as they do, and then recontextualizing, which means putting new knowledge about the phenomenon into a context established by others. So this is where you link what you found to the research that has already been done on the topic area. Again, you're trying to put everything together in context of the greater knowledge that has been generated about the topic or the problem or whatever you're adding new things to this information, but that information still exists out there in some way or another, which is why we do literature reviews. When you're thinking about data analysis, a good analogy is it's like cleaning a closet. The same basic steps apply here. So first, when you are cleaning a closet, you take everything out of the closet. Then you sort through it and decide what you're going to save and what you're going to get rid of. Then you look at what you have left, organize it into subgroups or different groups. You organize those groups into clusters of similar things, and then you put things back into the closet in a better way so that it's easier to understand, it's easier to use, it's more functional. So taking everything out of the closet is basically collecting your data. Sorting everything out is then transcribing your data, going through and cleaning that data up, getting rid of things that don't apply. And then you look what you have left and you start trying to group it together. And then you take these subgroups. This is a little bit backwards, but I'll clear it up as we go along. Basically, the organizing into subgroupings is done through a process of line-by-line coding and then creating from those line-by-line codes focused codes. That tends to be what 3 and 4 are together, is doing that line-by-line coding and then developing it into focused codes and then into categories. Chunking is the idea of taking text that you've been reading and highlighting the parts of the text that all are about the same thought. It's something that you can do instead of line-by-line coding, is to chunk. So you go through with a highlighter on the transcript and you highlight different areas in different colors based on what it is they seem to be talking about. Are they talking about relationships that you may highlight a paragraph or a group of sentences that talk about relationships together as one sentence? Are they talking about travel? If there's a whole section where they're talking about travel, is it all about traveling to the same place, or are they traveling to different places? You may want to chunk the different places together. But line-by-line coding tends to do the same thing because you code every line that has meaning towards the topic you're gathering, and then you pull those together, you cluster them together to create focused codes, and then you cluster the focused codes to create categories. So based on some of the theories that you've learned, the idea behind the data analysis is a bit different. In grounded theory, you're doing constant comparative analysis, and that means you're comparing one interview to another, 2 sets of interviews to another interview, and so on. As every new interview comes in, you compare it to the previous interviews. You may change codes, you may add new codes, you may subtract codes. Depending on the data coming in, you're doing a constant comparative study. Narrative analysis uses stories to gather insights into experiences. So the stories themselves are the data that you then gather together to get some insight into the experience of the person who's telling the story, and then you retell that story in a way that focuses it for the reader to better understand the phenomenon that you're studying. In phenomenology, you're uncovering the underlying structure. So you focus on depth and detail, which is when you're doing a phenomenology, you want to know everything that the person knows about the phenomenon. You want to know, do they have special code words? Do they have ways of describing the phenomenon that might be different than other people's ways of describing them? What terminology do they use when they're talking about the phenomenon that may not be clear? You dive in deeper. If somebody says, I went out yesterday to go spelunking and it was really fun, if you're doing a phenomenology, you would say, well, okay, what do you mean by spelunking? Can you define that for me? And then they would tell you the definition of it. And then you might want to ask them more questions about it so that you can get a greater understanding of what this experience is for them. Whereas in ethnography, you're trying to get to know a culture, its beliefs and processes, which is why ethnographies take so long. You are really taking time to gather a lot of different types of data, observations, interviews, documents, pictures. You may make videos of people doing some process. Like, for example, if you're looking at a colony of pottery people who make pots, sometimes they live in colonies, or at least they gather in colonies to sell their stuff together and to work. These artist kind of colonies, you want to understand the culture. You may videotape somebody making a pot. You may videotape somebody making a sale or talking to a customer. This is so that you can get a better understanding and review of the processes that are going on. With case study, you use various different methods to gather data on the case. The thing about case study and the data that you analyze from it is you are looking at a bounded system. So it has to have very specific boundaries that you're looking at so that you can then, within those boundaries, describe the data that you're finding. It's just a little bit extra information there. So that's what I've tried to tell all of you or hoping you all got and kind of told you a little bit, is the idea that there's going to be different research questions for each of these types of analysis. In grounded theory, you're going to look at the influences, pre-service teachers' experiences of teaching science. What influences? What are their influences? This is the theory you're trying to develop. In narrative analysis, you want to hear the story. So how do pre-service teachers experience teaching science? Tell me your story about that. What are the pre-service teaching experiences of teaching science? So again, with phenomenology, you're again wanting to look at the experience of it, the phenomenon of teaching science. And then ethnography, of course, we would be looking at the different contexts and the cultural aspects of that. Case study, you usually also have what or how questions for a case study as well, but they don't have to focus so much on the experiences, more as in the case study, it's more of just asking the questions that you need to have answered, wanting to know something that isn't necessarily heavily focused on a theory or a experience, but more about the place, the case boundaries. Remember, cases, studies have boundaries. When doing qualitative research, there are 4 basic steps. Raw data management. That means that you're going to go through your data and you're going to clean it. What cleaning data typically means is you might remove some of the or if you have a transcriber that transcribes every single word, every nuance, then you may want to clean that up a little bit. If for example, you were interviewing somebody about how they do carpet cleaning, and the person you're interviewing goes on a tangent and talks about their garden, you probably want to remove the section where they talk about their garden, because that's not part of the data you're collecting. You're collecting data on carpet cleaning. So if the participant goes off on a tangent about, tree maintenance or gardening, you want to cut that out of the interview. That's data cleaning. You're cleaning the data down to get to the parts that apply to whatever it is you're trying to find out about. Data reduction then is where you're going and doing your line-by-line coding, or you're doing your chunking. You're pulling things together, or your line-by-line coding to create a initial list of codes. Typically, that line-by-line coding can generate 100 codes or more. And then from that point, you go into the interpretation where you're doing focused coding, or clustering of different like concepts together into a bigger code. You can also, in data interpretation, go up to categories, where you take the line-by-line codes and then you group them together to create focus codes, and then you group those together to create categories. And then finally, you take your categories and you group them together to create themes. Themes are the representation of the data. It's telling the story and making sense of the data for others. That's the whole goal of qualitative research, is to take what you've experienced and put it in a way that other people can absorb it and make sense of it. You know, after you've interviewed somebody, you are already going to have a very good idea of what it is they've said and how it answers your question. Because remember, you had a research question. From that research question, you created interview questions. You know, so if your research question is, what color do my participants perceive the sky as being? And then you interview those participants and you ask them the question, look up and tell me what color you think the sky is. And then you get all of that data together and it becomes a bunch of people telling you different shades of blue, for example. So the clustering all that together, extrapolating that into the theme, you're going to be able to then answer. You're already going to know that the answer to your question is some shade of blue because you've heard all the people say blue. So you've already got the idea that the theme of what is the color of the sky is going to be blue. But you still go through the process of coding because you may find other aspects that you didn't know. And that's why there are two different ways to go about qualitative research, deductive or inductive. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But the idea is when you have seen all of this data, when you've collected all of this data, you're already going to be somewhat of an expert in these participants' stories, these participants' information. But part of the process of qualitative research is you're going to want to be thinking about things as you go along. You're going to want to be taking notes. You're going to want to be maybe taking images. You're definitely going to record what you are doing. Now with Zoom, we all have the ability to create a video of an interview that is done remotely. It really is going to save a ton of time for people because not only can you create that video, but there are programs that will then create a transcript, a closed captioning transcript of that interview. That will save you a ton of time because you can take that closed captioning, you can correct it and make sure it's right, and then you can use that as your transcribed interview. It will save people money, it will save people time. Plus, you'll have a video that shows you the participants' mannerisms, their way they're expressing themselves. So you'll go through that and you will pull all that together. You'll have notes that you've taken. You may have observational notes. You may have images. You may have transcripts. There are all different types of information that you can code. As long as the information is words or is an image that can be described, you can create codes from it. And then coding can be done, of course, for your dissertation, you'll do it as an individual, but you can also do it as a team. You can have a group of researchers who are working on the research together. They've participated in the field work. Ideally, they've actually done some interviews themselves. And then they understand what it is that you're trying to develop. They understand what your goals are with this particular interview or with this type of the research that you're doing. So together, you can all work to generate coding for the data that you're getting. And before you start coding, you're definitely going to want to read the raw data and make notes. Again, this is part about getting to know your data. Once you have really immersed yourself in the data, the coding will become very easy. You know, I imagine when you're going to be coding for the discussion board this week, you're going to have read through that transcript maybe one time. But some of you may just try to code immediately as you're reading it. And that will be a mistake because you don't really have a good idea of what's being said. So you need to read through the entire transcript. If you were actually doing the interview, you would have heard the interview, so you would have heard it. Then you would have transcribed it. Then you would have read the transcription, and then you would sit down and start coding. So it's going to be a lot of getting to know that data. Once you've done several interviews, you're going to start to become an expert in this area. You're going to know backwards and forwards what was being said in these interviews. This is how you then are going to be able to write the findings chapter and the discussion chapter of your dissertation. The interview, coding an interview could take up to 8 hours. Sometimes focus group coding can take, up to a couple of days. This is why it's important to understand when doing research that it's not going to be something that you can do in an afternoon. It's not going to be something that you can do quickly. It takes time to do the research because you're going to have to live with the data for a while. You're going to have to make sure that you understand it. One of the things about qualitative research, if you do an inductive study, and again, I'll talk about that in a second, your codes become a roadmap. So you generate your initial line-by-line codes. You may have 100 of them. Of course, you can't use all of those codes. So you cluster the codes into focused codes and then eventually into code categories. But the thing is this, is some codes aren't going to be used. Some codes aren't going to create categories. They're going to get lost or left behind because they were only in 1 or 2 interviews, or they don't really address your research questions. Those clustered codes, focused codes, then become categories. The categories then become themes. They're clustered into themes. The themes become the subheadings of your chapter in your dissertation or in your research report. The findings chapter, the themes are the subheadings of that chapter. In your discussion chapter, which would be chapter 5 in the dissertation, the research questions are the subheadings and the themes are talked about under the research question. But in the findings, you're presenting your findings, which are the themes. The roadmap part of this is when you're writing about your themes, you can look back to see what categories were in those themes, and that will then give you the codes to look back. And when you find the codes, you can then go back to your data and see exactly where those codes are. And then you can pull quotes from the participant interviews that most symbolize that code. Because you're not going to want to take every time a participant talked about the weather in every single interview. If that's one of your themes and goes down to the code of weather, say for example, you're not going to want to pull a quote from every participant. What you're going to want to do is find a quote from the participant that most symbolizes that code. So what quote most really shows what all of the people said about that code or that theme. So that will be your findings. That's how you present them. So there are different ways to approach coding. Like I said, you can go from a theory, which is deductive analysis. You can base it on the field work, which is inductive analysis, basically looking at it from a standpoint of what emerges from the interview. Or you can do it in vivo, which means while you're coding, you are making notes, you're creating codes, you're removing codes, that kind of thing. And then in memoing, and memoing is where you're making memos about what you have found or what you have discovered throughout the process. So those are the different ways in which you can use codes and memos to create the structure that you're going to be doing. So now let me get into actually what I mean by deductive and inductive. There are different ways to look at coding, and depending on what you're doing, you may be trying to prove something. For example, if there is a theory already out there, if people have actually done studies that have collected initial data, and you want to learn more about it, you may actually take a theory and create your themes and codes before you collect the data. And then once you've collected the data, you take those themes and codes and you try to apply it to the data and see if it applies. That's kind of a way to test codes. So you may find that the list of codes you had initially were actually perfect because that's what you found when you did the interviews. Or you may find that some of those codes don't work, some of those codes need to be changed. Inductive, which is the more common way to analyze the data, is when you actually use the data to create codes from that data without preconceived notions of what codes you're going to find. Now, again, because you've read the data, you may have an idea of what codes you're going to find, but you don't actually go into it thinking that you already know. So here's kind of a way that this looks. You basically are looking at a thematic analysis where you go from the general principle to the actual cases of what you studied, or you're doing an inductive analysis where you're taking what you studied and you're going to the general principle or to the themes. And again, here's another way of looking at it. You have inductive, you have the codes that you create categories from the codes, you create themes, and then you can go on to create a theory if you're doing grounded theory. So you're going from the concrete to the abstract. Deductive reasoning is you're taking a general theory and you're then breaking it into themes, categories, and codes, and then applying those to the data and seeing if what you have found is what you find. You're deducing whether or not what you've thought about is real. Either way, no matter which direction you're going, the concept of pulling these codes together is all about finding commonalities. So, for example, you're trying to analyze how adolescents can better be served in a mental health capacity. That's your research question. How do you best do that? If you come at it from the deductive side, you want to find a way, you theorize is that friendly services for adolescents are about access, availability, and other things. Then you go into your data and you have your codes and you find actual examples of these. Going the inductive way, you have these things here. Let's say, for example, you have geographic accessibility, economic accessibility, acceptability, opportunity, follow-up. All of these things relate to access, so they could be collapsed down into a category called access. You have other codes that go into the category of availability, and then other codes that go into a category of etc. blah blah. The idea here is that you are finding codes that uniquely can fit into this category. You typically do not want codes to overlap into different categories because they should be more discrete than that. You shouldn't have a lot of overlap between where you have codes that are in 3 or 4 different categories. A code should be specific to the category that it is made up into. The same is true for the categories going into the themes. Typically, you don't have several categories going into one theme. Instead, you more often have a group of categories that are only in part of the theme that you are developing. So you don't have other things that distract you. Now, let me show you an example here of where it comes from. So here is the interview. You can see the person is talking about the instructor that in this course, what has helped them the most in this course. And so when you're reading this line by line, now, to understand this, line by line doesn't mean that you, for every sentence or every line in your transcript, you develop a code. What line by line coding means is that you read each line to see if a code will develop. In this case, this first sentence, you can see the bracket here, is basically talking about encouraging expression of viewpoint. So you can see how they got that category from that. Overlapping in this as well is they're also talking about the instructor encouraging questions. So this one sentence has really 2 codes within it. Then you have another whole sentence here that really talks about responding to questions, and then explaining concepts, checking for understanding, student feels valued, and student feels involved in their own learning. Now, let me break this down a little bit more because I need to back up a little bit. The type of coding they're doing here is more along the lines of what we would call initial coding, because what they're doing is using their own words to kind of pull out what the participant says. So they use some of the participants' words, but they use their own kind of way of pulling it together. Because you can notice here, the participant never said viewpoint. They never said expression either. Encouraging was the only word that pulled from the thing. Typically in line-by-line coding, so the difference between like what I would say initial coding or line-by-line coding tends to try to use the exact words of the participant. So if I line-by-line coded this, I would say the instructor engaged us, or the instructor engaged might be a code. Voice opinions might be a code. That would be line-by-line coding, as I'm looking for these in a line-by-line way. Going up then to a higher level of extrapolation would then be doing the initial coding. Or in some people go straight from line-by-line coding to focused coding. Again, you want to kind of capture what these codes all mean. So if you look at this, the focused code is encouraging student participation, encouraging questions, responding to questions, encouraging expressions of viewpoint. Explain content, check for understanding. That collapses up to presentation of context. And then student feels valued, students involved in their own learning, student empowerment. You could then take these focused codes and then from those create a category that maybe they would all fit into. Now, in this case, I'm not entirely sure the category would be anything more than, you would have to have more data before you could create a category from this, because each of these could be a category. So you want to look at it and see where the focused codes come into play. And in that example, it's important to note that an initial code might be the title of the focused code, and that might be the title of the category if it makes sense. It doesn't have to be a new idea each time. It can be that the focused or initial code could really, all of these kind of could be combined into that initial code, which would create your focused code of the same name, because it really expresses all of these points of view. So in that way, encouraging could have been a focused code that they used here. And responded to questions could be encouraging as well. I mean, that way you could look at it in that light. It basically pulls what's being said out. And this is in an inductive way of looking at the data. You're taking the bigger picture, chopping it up, and then you're conceptualizing it into a more abstract point of view. And the process of coding, during this process, is when you start to have ideas about what theme could you be developing. What is it that is common to the participants when they're talking about this? What is uncommon? You'll start to see, maybe if you interviewed women and men as part of your study, you start to see the men respond differently to the same question than the women do. That's important to note. Those are the kind of things you write down in your memos, and those will then come out when you're discussing the theme. The theme could be the same from both what the men and women said, but the women said it in a different way than the men did, but it still amounted to the same theme. This is how you can then discuss it later by saying, my theme is student participation, and in that theme I found that female respondents more often talked about the community, being encouraged, being allowed space to say their viewpoint. Whereas the men more often talked about being able to raise their hand and get acknowledged, or to be able to feel good about having the correct answer. All of those are about student participation, but you see the woman's view is different than the man's view. You want to talk about that in your findings. If they were the same, then you would just find the best examples and put those in as your quotes, because the findings chapter is mostly quotes from the participants to illustrate how you created these categories and themes that you eventually came to. One of the other really good ways of representing your data, and I did this in my study and it was super useful, is mind mapping. And here's an example of mind mapping. The idea here is you take your codes and then you take the categories and you kind of try to connect them all together and see if there's maybe other connections to be made. So maybe one of these, let's say intermarriage, also what connects to family life. So you could draw a line also to family life. You could also draw a line maybe to schooling, that kind of thing. Or marriage and career could also go to career aspirations. So you see the main things that these are related to, but by drawing lines to other aspects of the map, you can start to see connections, and that can really help you develop your themes, because you start to see where the things are interconnected, and then it allows you to then look at that and develop themes from it. Okay, so that's all I had about coding. I hope I didn't make it more complicated. The main thing to understand is this concept of taking something that is concrete, the interview data, and then extrapolating it out to make it more abstract so that you can then get a better understanding of it. So hopefully that will be helpful. Have a good week.